we are the youth organisation of the European movement, which organises a range of events, mainly in London, but also in branches all over the country. We're also associated with a pan-European organisation called JEF. Our members have the opportunity to travel all across Europe to attend conferences and events and participate in informing opinions of our leaders right across Europe. It's interesting to have this debate today on a day when the Foreign Secretary has promised a constructive and serious British contribution to the debate about Europe's future. And I'm sure we'll have a pretty serious contribution today, and possibly even more constructive than we might expect from the UK government, knowing the panellists. I'm particularly pleased that we're doing this on a cross-party basis, continuing our work with the three youth organisations of the three main parties. And I'd also like to thank the UCL European Institute for helping us to host the event today. I'm going to hand over to Matt from the Young Conservative Europe group, who's going to also do a little introduction. Thanks very much.
Good evening, I'm Matt Lewis, I'm the chairman of the Young Conservative Europe group. I'm going to keep this short and sweet because there are people who are far more interesting than myself that I know you're aching to listen to. Just over a year ago, myself and Andrew Noakes, who was then the chairman of the London Young European Movement, got together and had a moan over a pint or two about how the European debate had become stuck in silos with each political party sort of talking to itself. And wouldn't it be great if youngsters from all three parties and none in the European movement could get together and break down those borders and have a proper debate? So it's taken a bit of time, but here we are this evening. Thank you for joining us. We're calling it the EuroDebate. This is the first of what we hope will be a regular series. You can join in with our brand new hashtag EuroDebate, all of you who are in the Twitterati. So I'm going to pass you over to Kira, who's our chairman for this evening. We're going to have our three speakers, and then at the end, a series of questions and a wine reception that we hope you join us for. But Kira will describe more about the event. Thank you.
A third welcome from me as well. My name is Kira, who as was mentioned earlier. I am the new chair of Young European Movement London. I will not talk anymore because I agree with Matt fully that I feel like I have people on my right who will have more interesting things to tell you. However, I'm briefly going to describe how this is going to work. So after brief introductions of what we actually have here today, we're going to hear three speeches of about 10 minutes length each from the speakers, after which we will hand it over to the audience. You will have time for all your questions and comments then. We will not be taking any points of information during the speeches. So hold your horses, you will get all your answers towards the end. But just to briefly introduce our speakers today, Robert Buckland is barrister and Conservative Party politician. He was educated at Hatfield College, Durham and Inner Temple. He was elected Member of Parliament for South Swindon in 2010. In Parliament, Robert sits on the Justice Select Committee and is chair of a number of APPGs. He's currently co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for the European Union. Then we have Martin Horwood, who's a Liberal Democrat politician. Martin studied modern history at the Queen's College at Oxford, after which he went into advertising and the charity sector. He has been Member of Parliament for Cheltenham, so close. We practiced this in advance since 2005, and this last year has been the chair of the Liberal Democrats Parliamentary Committee on International Affairs. And then last but certainly not least, we have Emma Reynolds from the Labour Party. She's been the Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton North East since 2010. She was educated at Wharton College at the University of Oxford, where she read politics, philosophy and economics. Prior to becoming an MP, she worked in Brussels for the Party of European Socialists and in the commercial public affairs sector. She's currently Shadow Minister for Europe. Unfortunately, we will not have Paula Crum speaking, the Director of Policy Network, because he's just informed me that his kids have brought home a disease. Without going into detail because he's unable to go today. But I think we're more than happy with the speakers that we have today. And without further ado, I would love to welcome on stage Robert Buckland.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very warm introduction. It's good to see, albeit a fairly small room, but a very full room of people, no doubt, who, despite the attractions of central London on a, where are we, Tuesday night, have chosen to come and join us to talk about what is at the moment a very shadowed topic, the future of the EU. The present that we live in is a very shadowed present. It's overshadowed by what seems to be unremittingly gloomy news about economic crisis in the eurozone. But my basic message to you all is that we need to take the long view. We mustn't let the troubles of the here and now determine our future road. Now, many of you here are much younger than me. Some of you, who I know very well, are significantly older than me. But I think it's right to remind ourselves of why it is that we as a country 40 years ago decided to join what was then the European Economic Community. It was because we had lived through terrible shadows in the 20th century. We lived through 2 world wars that ripped the continent apart, that meant that we spent billions of pounds in blood and treasure, and that whether we liked it or not, we were always drawn into the affairs of our neighbours in Europe. That's been the history of this country. We've either been willfully blind to the balance of power in Europe, or we have been dragged into it, kicking and screaming, and had to take part and use force of arms. Now, it seemed to our fathers and forefathers that that was a wrong approach, that the cycle was depressingly familiar, that something had to change, that the experience that they all had in the Second World War meant that we had to do better. We were a bit late to the game. Sadly, the post-war government decided that the European Community was some sort of capitalist club and didn't want us to join. Despite the best efforts of Harold Macmillan, we weren't able to join because of good old President de Gaulle and his particular view of France's role in Europe. But we moved on, and under the stewardship of Edward Heath, we joined. And the Conservative Party, of which I've been a member now for more years than I care to remember, was the party of Europe. It is the only one of the 2 main parties, and Martin will forgive me here because the Liberals have been consistently in favour of Europe. Of the 2 main parties, the Conservative Party has been consistently in favour of our membership of the European Community and the European Union. That's still the case now. Whatever you may think about some of the debates that have gone on within the Tory party over the last, well, I have to say now, the best part of 20 years. And I'm not here really to talk about debates between the parties, because the truth is that Europe is a debate that is often divided within the parties. That's undeniably the case. We had a referendum back in 1975 because there were divisions within the then governing Labour Party that the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, thought were best addressed with by a referendum. And it worked. We had a very clear decision, a 2-to-1 vote in favour of our membership of the European Community. And then the question as to why we needed to be a member of the European Community was answered time and time again in the affirmative. We had the Single European Act in 1986, which Margaret Thatcher readily signed up to, which her government enacted into law, which committed to Britain to, let's not forget the words, ever closer union. And then we had what I regard still as one of the most important developments in our integration into the European Union, which was the Treaty of Maastricht. Much derided still by some members of my party, in my view, one of the most successful negotiations that we conducted as a government. Getting the balance right, striking the right chord, committing ourselves to proper integration where it was in our national interest, but making sure that we had those necessary opt-outs where it was appropriate. And then we had the big debate about the euro. I took a view some 10 years ago that we should have gone in. We should have gone in with countries of the north of Europe and created, I think, what would have been a very different beast from the one that we see now. But you know, politics is about the world that we live in rather than the world that we like it to be. And the fact is that the history of our country in the European Union has taken us down a certain course. We're not a member of the eurozone, and nor are we likely to be. We're not a member of a lot of the agreements such as Schengen that bring together other countries in Europe. But at the same time, we still stand strategically and politically in a very important place. There are huge common interests that we still have with the major countries of Europe, such as Germany, that mean to me that the question that is posed, does Britain have a future in the EU, is, to use the well-worn phrase, an absolute no-brainer. It's got to be a yes. Now the problem for us, I think, and this is a problem that bedeviled the last government as much as it bedevils this government, is that we live in a country where increasingly powerful interests are lining up against Britain's membership of the European Union. I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago speaking to my colleagues in the CDU, and the media picture in Germany is so much more benign for those people who favour membership of the European Union. The German media are still by and large favourably disposed to Germany's role in Europe. I wish I could say the same about our media here in London. We are facing a concerted campaign from certain parts of the media that it seems to me designed to have one outcome, which is to drive us out of the European Union. Now, it's a significant campaign. It's being waged quite openly in some sections of the press, perhaps a bit more surreptitiously in other sections, but it is one that is systematically undermining the positive arguments that are still out there for membership of the European Union. And it's also a debate that has become very clouded, and I speak as a lawyer, in legalese. When you go into the House of Commons, and my colleagues will back me up on this 100%, the debates that we often have about the European Union are all about the interpretation of various articles, the legal opinions that are expressed to and fro, and very seldom about the realities of what membership of the European Union means to the people who I represent, for example, in Swindon. Now, Swindon is typical of our country. It is a town with manufacturing, with IT, with life sciences, with a whole range of industries that trade with the eurozone and beyond. Let's take Honda UK, Japanese company but a British setup. 50% plus of its cars go to the eurozone. If we withdrew from the EU tomorrow, suddenly the cost of those cars would go up by 10%. Suddenly a tariff barrier would appear that is not there at the moment. Now, for my workers in Honda, to talk about withdrawal from the EU is just madness. It's their job going down the Swanee. It's their livelihood, their family finding that the breadwinner is no longer in work. Now, that's a very simple example of a greater truth. That if we're going to win the debate about our continuing membership of the EU, we need to stop talking legalese and start talking about the real world, real jobs and real people. And the argument is there to be won. I am absolutely convinced that if we end up in a situation where we have a referendum, and being frank, it seems to me that we are bit by bit edging our way towards that scenario. And of course there's another question about what the issue would be, what the referendum would be about. It is incumbent on those of us who still believe our future lies in the EU to make those real life arguments and to get the support of business and industry as well to make the case for our membership. It's as plain and simple as that. Because I believe that the current problems of the eurozone, whether you're focusing on Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, will pass. Like everything, we will move on. We will move on, probably not into an era of huge soaring growth in Europe, but I believe that we will move into an era of greater stability. Why do I say that? Because I am convinced that Germany wants this to work. Germany believes that its whole national interest is so vested in the future of Europe and the eurozone that it will have to do more or less whatever it takes to make it work. The one worry that I have about the future of Germany and its involvement in Europe is whether or not at any stage inflationary pressures start to appear at home. And then we do have a serious question to ask. Now, I know I sound perhaps Panglossian or Micawberish, if you like, about the future of Europe, believing that something's going to turn up. But I genuinely believe that if we take the longer view, if we put the troubles of today in their proper perspective, then we will have the vision and the guts to actually stand up and realise that if this country pretends that somehow it's Norway or Switzerland or Iceland or Greenland, then it really has forgotten its historic role in the affairs of Europe. And I'll end on this note. 200 years ago, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we had the Congress of Vienna. Britain had been a major player in making sure that Napoleon Bonaparte and his breed of government was expunged from the European continent. Did it occur to British Tories that they wouldn't turn up at the Congress of Vienna? Did Lord Castlereagh decline to attend? No, he didn't. He went there and played a key part in what was a peace that lasted for the better part of a century in the main. Britain's role is firmly within Europe. For us to turn our back is not only to turn our back on our past, but it is to turn our back on our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira. And it's good to see you all here, except you all look so young, it's making me feel very old. And I feel particularly old at the moment, because the other day was my 50th birthday. That's exactly the right response, thank you very much. And actually, thinking back to when I was growing up, it's quite instructive, and it almost takes an effort of will now to remember what Europe looked like when I was younger than you. Half of Europe was dominated by Soviet dictatorships enforced at the barrels of tanks. Southern Europe had a string of military dictatorships or nominal democracies that frequently flipped into military dictatorship through coups. Spain was still a fascist country, effectively, run by the Phalange. So the map of democratic free Europe was quite thin and fragile looking at the time. And we grew up under the shadow of the Cold War thinking, actually, this wasn't guaranteed to be something that would last our whole lifetimes. And one of the reasons I joined what was then called the Liberal Party was this vision that European liberals had, Western European liberals, I guess, mainly in that era, was this vision of the whole of Europe being a federation of free democracies. And this felt like in some ways like a pipe dream at the time, but it was a very inspiring vision. And I sometimes still have to pinch myself to realise that that vision has more or less come to pass. That from Estonia to Portugal, we now have that federation of free democracies, and it's an extraordinary achievement. If you've studied world history, this is almost unprecedented that an entire continent can come together in peace and cooperation. And I have to say, somebody put it very well earlier on today. Someone who is sometimes painted as a bit of a Eurosceptic, and from Rob's party, which is our Foreign Secretary William Hague, but he made a speech today on the future of Britain in Europe, in which he said the European Union, alongside NATO, has been an instrument of peace and reconciliation. It has helped to spread and entrench democracy and the rule of law across Europe. It has helped make armed conflict between its members unthinkable. He had to go all the way to Berlin to make it safely from his own party, but at least he said it, okay? At least he said it, and I think that's very positive. I mean, my role as chair of the Liberal Democrat Committee on International Affairs, I do meet William on a fairly regular basis, and we always try and encourage him to speak out for what he does now, I mean, very genuinely believe, and acts on in very practical ways as Foreign Secretary, that our future does lie within the European Union. And it is still quite a controversial thing within his party, but we're encouraging him to say it more. The reason that a lot of people talk about the benefits of Europe is to do with the single market, and I think on the Conservative benches in Parliament this is the big, great achievement, and indeed that's, William talked about that as well today. In fact, he came up with such a good little snippet. I'm going to quote him a second time. I don't normally quote Conservative politicians all the time, although this isn't, but we're on a cross-party basis here, so this is very good. But he said, someone in Britain can go through a whole day dependent on the single market. A Pole, one of 500,000 living in our country, can leave their home, heated courtesy of a German company, E.ON, catch a bus owned by a French company, RATP, make a phone call using a Franco-German provider, Orange, on a Nokia phone from Finland, and stop to get their money from a Spanish bank, Santander. Others may preach Europe, but Britain practices it. Well, that last claim might be a bit strong, but the point is, I think the virtue of the single market and the fact that we are so integrated now into the European economy is one of the reasons why, for anyone with a basic understanding of economics, the idea of us withdrawing from that should be unthinkable. I mean, some Eurosceptics often talk about the example of Norway. I don't know how many of them know that Norway pays 550 million euros a year to the European Union as a kind of administration fee for its participation in various EU programmes. They are in the situation, I mean, William Hague, in a former, slightly more Eurosceptic incarnation, coined the phrase that he wanted Britain to be in Europe but not run by Europe. Well, Norway is out of Europe but still run by Europe, because they actually, in order to gain access to that, now what is it, 12 trillion euro market, they need to comply with all the rules of the single market, but they play absolutely no part in actually forming those rules. They have no seat at that table. So they have to comply with lots of European rules in the way that our Eurosceptics complain about, but they actually have no role in setting them. And there is a risk, of course, if we withdrew from the European Union, that actually the European Union countries that remain might be a bit less relaxed about allowing access to European markets to Britain than they are to countries like Norway, which don't pose a great economic threat. I mean, would they be as sympathetic or as understanding of the special position, for instance, of the City of London and our banks if we were outside the European Union? I'm not sure they would at all. So I think with Rob that it would be taking an enormous risk to withdraw in that way. But there are far more reasons why you should be in favour of remaining within the European Union. Consumer protection, let's take that one for a start. It's roughly my kids' bedtime now, and they're going to bed cuddly toys, which are all safe because there is a little E label on every single one. And we can be sure that wherever those toys are sourced from, that they comply with European safety standards. When we go on holiday, we carry European health insurance cards that now mean that wherever we go in Europe, we can be sure of the same health benefits. We make mobile phone calls that are 50% cheaper within the European Union, and in fact if you send a text message, I think it's 70% cheaper because of European consumer protection law. And if you don't believe me, try going to North America and making a mobile phone call from there. It's cheaper to fly back and talk to people in face to face. You've got airlines, if you choose to pollute the environment in this way. Airlines are cheaper within Europe because of European rules. And there's an amazing statistic I was given earlier on today that since 1993, when consumer protection around holiday companies came in, 1.1 million Britons have been flown home with at least their wallets intact, if not their holidays, after their holiday companies went bust, again, as a result of European consumer protection. Then there's Europe's role within the world. The idea that any one of 27 different countries could have the same weight within international negotiations is fantasy. We are negotiating free trade agreements between the European Union and Japan, Canada, India. We couldn't do that as 27 different countries and have the same impact. We're participating in everything from the Arms Trade Treaty to the Rio Summit, which is helping, and the subsequent process following the Rio Summit to set this new sustainable development goals for developing countries. We're participating in things like international sanctions on Iran, on a European basis. We're participating in the UNFCCC, the climate change negotiations, again, as the European Union, overwhelmingly. And there is a brilliant photograph of Chris Huju, actually, at the Durban summit, basically sitting at the top table, along with China and other global economies like this, trying to thrash out the details of the latest stage of that climate change process. And I'm not talking metaphorically, he's literally sitting at a table. It's about this big. Chris Huju's sitting here, the Americans are sitting here, the others are sitting around it, and all the other delegates are sort of sitting looking over them. You can see the photograph of this top table on the internet. And the idea that, again, we would be at that top table as just Britain on its own is fanciful. That he was there because he was speaking for the whole of Europe. In terms of our safety and security, the European arrest warrant is used to bring dozens, probably hundreds of suspects back from European countries to face trial in this country. Gloucestershire Constabulary, my own police force, last year participated in the breaking up of one of the largest human trafficking rings that's been operating across Europe. And they used the European arrest warrant to bring a local suspect back to Gloucestershire to face trial. The same has been used against serious and organised crime, against terrorists, against people trafficking and so on. So these are really important collaborative efforts that again would be put at risk if we were to withdraw from Europe. And there are some Eurosceptics who are very cross about the European arrest warrant and see this as some infringement of our sovereignty, you know. So I have suggested from time to time that we could indeed pull out of all these justice and home affairs cooperative measures. We'll just restrict our justice and home affairs things to the UK, providing we can get all the organised criminals and drug traffickers and human traffickers and terrorists to sign up to only operate in the UK and not to go across borders. I don't think that's very likely, personally. So I think the message is there are very many reasons why Britain needs to stay in Europe. I think on the economic front, we are at a dangerous moment in Europe's history, and there are various outcomes that can come from the impetus now taking place within the core of the eurozone towards greater integration, towards banking union, and towards more economic integration, and which will really create a kind of fast track of European Union. If that collapses and it's a disaster and the eurozone collapses, that's a bad outcome for us. If actually it doesn't quite come off and we kind of carry on muddling through and we have a kind of stagnant European economy, that's not a very good outcome for Britain either. But it may be quite a risky outcome if it succeeds, because the centre of gravity, the economic centre of gravity of Europe will have shifted somewhat. And we will have to work quite hard to make sure that we don't look as though we've been left on the outside. And this, if I have a criticism of William and the way he's presented government policy on Europe, it's that still the script is rather a lot about what we're going to try and pull back from Europe and how we're going to sort of withdraw from little bits. And it does kind of create the impression that we're heading for the exit door. And that is a dangerous thing for us to give the impression, that's a dangerous impression for us to give to our European partners, because they may believe it. And even if actually, at the last minute we say, oh no, we didn't actually mean leave, you know, as such, you know, we want to stay sort of involved, we'll find that the game has moved on, and that is quite a dangerous moment for us. So on all these for all these reasons, but most of all I think because of the amazing achievement of the European Union in cementing peace and democracy across the whole European continent, which is one of the most extraordinary political achievements, I think probably the most extraordinary political achievement of my lifetime, then I think the answer to the question, do we have a future in Europe, is absolutely yes. Thank you.
It's an unenviable position to be the last speaker at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening, and also to try not to be repetitive, but in this spirit of cross-party thinking, I just wanted to say it's a great pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank the Young European Movement and the other organisations involved in organising tonight's event, because it's a great pleasure and relief to me that we're not here talking about the legality of the fiscal compact treaty or the ins and outs of whether the banking union is legal or not, or all these various commons debates that we have. And I've only been in this job for a year, but I could recite some of the speeches of the honourable, mainly gentlemen on the other side, unfortunately. I hate to say it, Rob. Mind you, there is one on my side I could recite as well, but I won't go there. Now, in this spirit of cross-party thinking, I wanted to be critical of both my own party and of Robert's party, and to just say that in no general election has a party leader successfully used anti-Europeanism to win votes. So the first example of that is 1983. I wasn't active in politics at the time, but I'm told that we had the longest suicide note in history, the Labour Party, in which we promised to withdraw from the then common market. In 1983, we got our worst election result since the First World War. So, you know, not a good result for us. In 2001, and I won't lay this on thick given it's a criticism of your party, but in 2001, William Hague, in his former incarnation, before the Love-In, went around the country, backing the pound on his big battle bus. What good did it do him? No good at all. So, although there is an obsession by some parts of the media and by some members of Parliament, not all on Robert's side, mostly, but some on mine, about the constitutionality, about issues of sovereignty. Issues polling shows that what people really care about is the economy, their jobs, health, education. Europe is always bottom of the list for good or for bad. That's the reality of it. So what will they vote on in the next general election in 2015? I don't think they'll be voting on the constitutionality of the fiscal compact treaty.
No.
So where does that leave us? Well, I wanted to say, again, in the cross-party spirit, I'll be less cross-party in a minute, just in case you're worried about me, that on the very big questions, there is cross-party agreement between the leaders of our three parties. Firstly, that we should remain in. What that in means, we'll come to in a minute. But there is no party leader, of the three party leaders in our country, advocating that we withdraw from the European Union. There is no party leader advocating that we join the euro. And also, there is pretty much cross-party agreement on further extending the internal market and the fact that the internal market has been a great success in goods, but that it can be further improved. So, you know, on those three pretty big issues, there is cross-party agreement. Now, let me come to the critical bit, just because otherwise it's going to get boring. I have been, and we have been, critical of this government because, unfortunately, we feel that the Tory parties put the party interests before the national interest, and that the party management issues have overtaken decisions that should be taken to ensure that the UK maintains influence in Europe. What am I talking about? Last December, the walkout. We call it the walkout, we don't call it the veto, because I've already talked about the fiscal compact treaty, well, not in any length, but it went ahead without us. And I think that there is a great danger of the UK not being just in the second tier of a two-tier Europe, but unfortunately being almost in a tier of its own, right on the very margins if we're not careful. Because we know that the eurozone will have to integrate their economies more closely, and we agree on that, but that does bring risks in terms of UK influence. And we think at a time when there is a crisis in our closest trading partners, we should be constructive, not destructive. And I also wanted to say that some Eurosceptics, such as Liam Fox and others, think that the ambiguity of the government's commitment to Europe, or what they like to say as the ambiguity, and what is perceived as the ambiguity of the government's commitment to stay in the European Union, weakens, they say it strengthens our voice, but it actually weakens it, because our partners are saying, hold on a minute, we want to know whether you're in this for the medium to long term or not. If you're going to leave in 2, 3, 4 years' time, we're not going to invest that much in our relationship with you. And frankly, we're getting a bit impatient that you haven't made up your mind. So this is the message I'm receiving when I go to Berlin, when I go to Paris, when I go to Rome, and all the other places I have to visit. It's a hard life. But this is the message that I am receiving loud and clear. And I just wish that some of and I hate to be political about this because I think, Robert said he's been to Berlin recently, and I think that's brilliant. I spoke to one of your colleagues yesterday, another Tory MP, another pro-European Tory MP who'd also been to Berlin. But I fear that some other MPs are not understanding the perspective of others enough. And I think we neglect sometimes in our own country. Yes, there's politics, and we've seen this tonight, there's politics between our own parties on all sorts of issues, but there's also domestic politics within other European countries. And we shouldn't underestimate that. And the moves towards greater integration, and yes, we want the eurozone to succeed, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenges that they face, and we should be constructive. Now, I know you've been listening to us for far too long. Let me just make a couple of points about the wider issue of our membership. I think it would be totally mad in a world in which globalisation is increasing incredibly difficult and complex problems such as climate change, such as the movement of people, which in some cases can be a good thing, but brings with it its own challenges, such as helping the poorest countries, such as making sure we have an international financial system which is stable, not unstable. All of these problems can't be solved by individual countries just acting alone, especially not individual countries the size of our own. And actually, what's interesting about the European project is that other regions around the world are looking to Europe to see what works. And we have got many, many examples of what works. Take, for example, our cooperation, our agreements on how to combat climate change, and compare that to successive summits on trying to tackle climate change between other international actors. We've been much more successful on a European level. Take, for example, what Martin mentioned about tackling cross-border crime. The kind of cooperation that Europe has in tackling cross-border crime is looked at in awe around the world as a model for others to follow. And so to agree with my Tory colleague, we must take the long view. There are some great successes that we can look at. And my final point is, I wanted to, and I had a little, sorry, I've got a prompt. I was reading City AM this morning. I don't know if any of you read it. And I saw this ridiculous editorial, so I thought, I haven't written them a letter yet, so I thought I might share it with you, in which it says, Europe will become ever less relevant as century progresses. And the editor suggests that we choose the emerging economies rather than anchor ourselves to the sinking ship of the rest of Europe. I think that's a false choice. It's an argument I hear in the House of Commons all the time. But actually, if we are to compete internationally, globally, with economies the size and scale of China, India, Brazil, and others, we are much more powerful within a trading bloc of 500 million consumers, getting a better deal in terms of the terms of that agreement than we are alone. So this is a false choice. So in order to tackle those global challenges, in order to prosper, because growth in the world is coming from other quarters, unfortunately, not so much from Europe, but in order to harness those opportunities, we need to play a central role in the European Union. And I hope we don't go towards Brexit, and I think there is a danger of that. But I hope that people like yourselves, who may one day be in our parliament or other parliaments around the world, but in our parliament, will start having a much more sophisticated debate about and positive debate about our membership of the European Union than unfortunately we currently do. Thank you.
Can you spare like 5 more minutes with your questions? I promise we will get to them afterwards. We've been discussing this question of whether, and I feel like we are always, in this country, I find myself stuck in the question of whether there is a future for Britain in the EU. But if it so happens that we agree that there is a future, if we move to the question of how, what would you say is the biggest difference between the three parties on the question of how? I mean, David Cameron has promised that if the Conservative Party is elected for another term in government, he will renegotiate Britain's relationship. If we get to renegotiate that relationship, how should it look like, and what's the biggest difference party politically?
Do you want to take a round? Just so that I'm worried that you haven't got to speak. Can we take a round?
Yeah, good idea.
Well, I feel like,
okay. Sorry.
the only reason for this is because I feel like this is the sort of, it's all very nice and well that we agree, but before we sort of let them, whether we should get the role politics so that you don't get to be diplomatic with the questions afterwards.
Well, okay, let me go first. Well, I think I hinted at what our criticism of the current government is. I think there is a great danger that the current government, for party political reasons, is taking us to the margins, and I think that danger is even stronger because of the greater integration of the eurozone. And I think this idea, and I did a debate with, some of you might have heard of her, Andrea Leadsom, about her shopping list the other day, which is basically a list of policy areas she wants to repatriate. The idea that you go to the supermarket and you put things in the trolley and then you leave without paying, I mean, you know, it's a bit tricky. You know, the idea that we would just be able to renegotiate all these areas, so we can just have an internal market and not have any of the other obligations around consumer protection, which is incredibly important, or we're in favour of staying in the, you know, we opted into the social employment chapter. We're in favour of keeping those pieces of legislation. Sometimes they're problematic around the, you know, in terms of the detail, but we're in favour of them as a whole. So we are not in favour of a sort of even attempting a whole-scale renegotiation or repatriation, because simply we don't think it's realistic. And if it is realistic, it's not desirable, because at what point do we become de facto like Norway? If we withdraw from all of these areas, then we will have a lot less influence. Firstly, I don't think they'll let us, and secondly, if it were possible, I think it would diminish our influence. So I think that's a big difference. And I think there's a debate about that. Well, I'll let Robert speak for himself, but there's a debate about that within the Tory party as to how feasible that is. But I would say that in general terms, there's probably more similarity between us and the Dems on this point than there is with the Conservatives.
Well, that leads on quite nicely. I'm not going to. Well, I think Emma's being slightly unfair. You know, I mentioned Maastricht. For me, as a Conservative, I'm not the social chapter, and I still am not comfortable with it now. And frankly, if there was an opportunity for us to pull back from that, I wouldn't have a problem. But you know, we already have an example where the UK has taken a certain position, and that's on justice and home affairs. And that was a deal that actually was reached by the last Labour government in the Lisbon Treaty. And that seemed to me to be quite a sensible compromise. We had to make a decision by 2014, but whether we opt into the entire justice and home affairs, the old pillars we used to call it under Maastricht, or whether in fact we say, no, we don't want to opt into the whole thing, but we will choose some of the particular subject areas that we will participate in. Now, there's been a lot of heat, well, a lot of heat, frankly, about that in the last week or so. And I think some of the debate between the front benches is with respect to them been rather synthetic about justice and home affairs, because the Labour Party, if they were in government, would have done exactly the same thing, because it was their policy. The point is about where we are on justice and home affairs, which is quite a neat example, is that we will opt in to certain aspects of that regime. I mean, I can think, we talked about the European arrest warrant. I'm pretty sure that the United Kingdom will stay and opt back into the European arrest warrant, because some of the arguments that we Conservatives are having about it, namely the proportionality argument, in other words, should huge amounts of taxpayers' money and the time of prosecutors be vested in somebody stealing a bowl of fruit in Portugal being extradited back to Bulgaria? That particular question is one that not only concerns British politicians, it concerns Viviane Reding, who is the Vice President of the Commission in charge of Justice and Home Affairs. She herself agrees with the argument about proportionality. So let's not get totally fixated about British Conservatives somehow being out of kilter with thinking in Europe. That is not the case. And therefore I think that what I'd like to see is far more of a grown-up debate about exactly the detail that we have here. Now, Andrea Leadsom, who was a good friend of mine, and with whom I agree on a lot of things, has been criticised tonight as having the shopping list approach.
Shoplifting.
I think that's being unfair to her and to some of my friends in Open Europe, because I'm more than happy to have vigorous debates with them, but there are areas upon which we can agree. And one of my missions as a Conservative politician is to try and move the debate within my party away from the sterile arguments of the Maastricht era into a new approach whereby we are looking at the practicalities, perhaps disagreeing on some of the details, but coming to a broad consensus that our membership of the EU is non-negotiable. Now, Andrea herself supports my arguments about tariff barriers. She herself has put up the argument that withdrawal would be an increase in tariffs on British goods. So, there is, I think, perhaps more of a growing consensus amongst me and my colleagues than Emma and her colleagues in the Labour Party would care to admit.
The most obvious distinction between the Liberal Democrats and the other two parties on Europe is that we agree with each other on them. So we don't have these great sort of arcane debates within our parties about what we believe about Europe. Our belief in European Union is entirely consistent with our views on democracy and sovereignty generally, which is that sovereignty basically resides amongst people and that you can delegate it to whichever level of government is appropriate. And that applies to delegating power to your neighbourhood, to your local council, to national or regional government, to UK government, to European government, and even to the realm of the United Nations and international law. And we don't draw any magical distinction between any of those. It's what works, really. So that's a kind of philosophical detour. If you're looking at the practical side, I think actually, as has been said, the Justice and Home Affairs opt-outs are a rather good example of the differing approaches. Labour, I think Kira has actually rather mischievously managed to sort of extract division from the united front we were presenting. But anyway, Labour negotiated this slightly weird system, which was, I suppose, designed to look a bit Eurosceptic and appeal to the slightly Eurosceptic media, of this these 100 or so provisions relating to justice and home affairs, including the European arrest warrant, but many others as well. And what they negotiated is a system where we can't opt out of the ones that we think are sort of inappropriate or redundant. We have to opt out of the whole lot and then opt back in to the ones we think are good. Now, this is going to involve us in the most extraordinary kind of trench warfare in Parliament, with the pro-Europeans basically fighting for every measure that we think is good, and the anti-European fruitcakes on the Tory backbenches, the Europhobic sort of tendency on the Tory backbenches trying to take us out of everything. So it's going to be hell, actually, but it's going to provide lots of entertainment for people who can't sleep at night. I wish we hadn't gone into that whole exercise. And what I would want to do from the Liberal Democrat perspective is say, actually, we can provide real leadership in Europe if we only just commit to being part of it properly. And Justice and Home Affairs is a brilliant example. The head of Europol is a Brit. We have written quite a lot of the sort of European arrangements on justice and home affairs. We've been centrally involved in all this. The idea that we should wholesale pull out of it and then have this ridiculous kind of argument over every single aspect of it for months on end is very depressing. And I wish that as a European country, as part of Europe, we just embraced the idea of European Union and actually tried to provide real leadership within Europe. And I think that might be one antidote to this perception amongst our European partners that we are actually kind of becoming semi-detached.
Thank you very much. You see that we're slowly getting into the dirty details. We are now unleashing the beast, which is our audience. We're going to have... was that too much? We're going to have 3 questions at a time, and then we're going to let the speakers address them as they wish.
There's nothing more disheartening than watching a debate in the House of Commons on the European Union and finding you agree with Chris Bryant and Dennis McShane, and your entire party is sitting there frothing at the mouth and just leaving you feeling, thing. The biggest problem I think that we have, Conservative-wise, is the fact that, and I listened to the debate with Andrea Leadsom, the entire debate was constructed about how we could do a deal with UKIP. And the problem, I think, is that fear of UKIP is driving a huge amount of the Conservative Party view. I do think that there are problems. I do think one of the things that we, on Justice and Home Affairs, for example, the European arrest warrant, I wonder how many people and writers for the Daily Mail will be happy with the idea of Megan Stammers still being in France if we haven't been able to pull them back. But my question to you and my question to my Conservative colleague is this. what do you think we can do to actually get a more what I would call a Euro-realist viewpoint? I don't think that the Conservative Party and members of the Conservative Party will ever be, federalists or anything like that. But we have to somehow get away from this narcissistic, inward-looking view, which all it does is poison us, frankly. And I feel very sorry sometimes for ministers standing at the dispatch box, trying to be sensible, trying to answer questions. And it's not the Labour Party attacking them; it's the backbenchers. They're the ones standing up and and screaming at them. And I just think that what do we do to actually detoxify ourselves of this problem? And what can we do as part of actually a wider debate within the country to actually say to people, look, you don't necessarily have to like the European Union. I think maybe that's a distinction. You don't have to love it, you don't have to like it. There isn't that same kind of investedness that you get on the continent with this idea of a European ideal. But what can we do to actually demonstrate the benefit and actually demonstrate that we want to be involved, and actually how do we go about shaping that debate?
Thank you. Second question.
Yeah, my name is John Preston. I'm a member of the European movement and have been for a long time. I really want to make 2 points, and 2 of them have been made this evening. I want to reinforce them. One of them is about vocabulary, and the other is about cross-party joining together over Europe. Vocabulary. Now and again people say the referendum is going to be about leaving Europe. No, Europe is the one thing we do not leave. We are permanently in Europe. And it's the particularity of the European Union, and the two, as far as I'm concerned, are synonymous. But when you hear people say the referendum is about Europe, Europe is something. I joke with people. I say I drove from Huddersfield to Glasgow the other day. That was driving in Europe, if you see what I mean. And there was someone on the in one of the debates recently who was screaming across the House of Commons, "Your chums over there." No, they are our chums. It is not a battle. We are not fighting one against the other. We're all part of the same constitutional, almost civilizational structure. So I want to make that point. The other thing which is really my question, is how the pro-EU MPs right across the House of Commons between the different parties are going to get together for the battle to come, which is the European Parliamentary election, where UKIP is really bracing itself for a fight. We've got the general election, where whichever party wins must be committed to staying in Europe and mean it. And then you've got the possibility of a referendum where it really is, as in 1975, going to be absolutely vital that the pro-EU MPs not only garner themselves, but go on a persuasion act to make it how serious it is from a geopolitical point of view, that we must be, as I think it was you said, Robert, we really do have to be a Congress of Vienna 150 years later, really to keep democracy on the road and friendship on the road, and we really are all chums in this together. It's not them and us. So my question really, if you want a question out of all that, is how you guys are going to work together to make sure that the referendum in 2015, 16, whenever it is as good a result as we got, nearly 50 years ago.
Thank you. And the last question for this round.
2 weeks ago, there was a talk at the LSE by Guy Verhofstadt from the European Liberals and then Daniel Cohn-Bendit from the European Greens, giving their perspective from the continent, so to speak, and presenting their manifesto for post-national and federal Europe. I mean, you may or may not agree with this perspective, but they suggested that one of the reasons why Europe is not at the moment functioning very well is because of all these individual opt-outs from the different countries, and the fact that every different member state has a different sort of association with the union. And my question would be, to what extent would you perhaps agree or disagree with this statement, and how can we, basically, should we have a more consistent and unified Europe?
I don't believe that this sort of idealised federalist identity EU is going to work. You know, we have enlarged the EU consistently. We are about to enlarge again. Croatia will be coming in. I hope that Turkey will become a member of the EU. I really passionately believe that it must. I'm a huge fan of enlargement, but that means the sort of narrow federalist vision just ain't going to work. So the EU has to be an institution like no other before in history. And when you look at it, the way it has evolved is, as Martin has said, it's unique. We have a lot of intergovernmentalism when it comes to Europe. The Council of Ministers, who are elected politicians, let's not forget, to represent the member states, is a key player. And I think that that's very important, that the power remains there. But we have a commission as well that has unusually, and this is where it is difficult for British minds to accept, can initiate policy. And that's the difficulty, I think, for a lot of the British press. This is where we get this idea that we have bureaucrats telling us what to do. And the reality is, of course, that nothing the Commission says can go any further without the say-so of the other institutions. And I just think we need, in simple terms, to explain the reality of how the institutions of Europe work. So I'm not one of these ideologue federalists. I don't think that's where the British people are. I think to answer the question about the first question about where politicians stand with the British people, that's essentially the question. Are we frightened of UKIP? How do we tack to the right to support them? The truth is, the British people are neither Europhile nor Eurosceptic. They're deeply pragmatic about the future of Europe. They view it in the prism that Emma has suggested, through their livelihoods, through jobs, through the economy. Is it good for my family? That's why they'd be content with the settlement, Britain's settlement with Europe, which is why, although I've said that we need to take a long view, we are in a very difficult economic time, which could affect the way in which families and individuals see Europe. Because if they come to a settled view that Europe is bad news economically and that it's going to drag us down, we've got a problem. And that's far more fundamental than any constitutional or legal argument. So my view is that forget about other parties if you're a Conservative, get on with making the case for Britain's pragmatic membership of the EU and argue the case in economic terms. Fear, as you said, is no lodestar for the political party. The Tory party has been at its very best when it has been bold, has appealed to the common ground of British politics, and has chosen hope over fear. When you made the general point about Europe, absolutely right. It's important that we be reminded about that. How do EU politicians come together? Well, it's not just going to take us politicians sitting at the table. It's going to take a whole range of other interest groups as well to come together in support in a coalition. And I've mentioned business and industry. It is essential that we hear voices from large businesses, small businesses, medium businesses who make the economic case for Europe, supporting what we as politicians do. So this has to be, if you like, a grand coalition of all sorts of interests, not just business. We've talked about the environment tonight. We've talked about consumer issues tonight. We've talked about free movement of persons. All these particular themes need to be drawn together as part of a constructive, positive argument that I believe we can win. If we do have an in-and-out referendum, I say bring it on, and we will win it if we have to.
How do we win the European argument? It's one within the Liberal Democrats. I think it's largely one within the Labour Party, and I think Emma does a fantastic job of promoting that argument within the Labour Party, although there have been Labour leaders in the past who've been inclined to drift into slightly Eurosceptic language at times, and I think she needs to fight against that and get people to stand up for what they really believe in. Two battlegrounds that really matter, I have to say, are the Conservative Party and the media. Within the Conservative Party, I think Rob does a grand job, but he's a bit outgunned at the moment. And if you are active in the Conservative Party, I think you just need to stick your heads above the parapet and start, when you hear people in Parliament talking complete nonsense from Tory backbenches, then you need to have a go at them from a Conservative perspective on Twitter, on Facebook, on every media that you can find. You need to be writing letters to the papers, you need to be writing them letters saying, I am a Conservative and I disagree with this. And the issue about the opt-outs is not one that really frames the debate. It may irritate people in Europe that we keep going on about them, but I don't think it's a central part of the argument. I think, if anything, the more important issues are the actual substance of the politics. They are actually about policing, about the environment, about economics. And the frustration, actually, I think it might have been Emma who said earlier on, is that so many of the debates we hold in Parliament end up being about the minutiae of treaties and opt-outs and all this technical stuff. It's like you're trying to sort of describe a car by, arguing over every nut and bolt and whether it should go here and there, and forgetting what it's actually for. And although Parliament is somewhat to blame in that, and we need to reform the way we scrutinise European legislation, and I think get it out of the hands, actually, I hate to say, of Bill Cash and his European Scrutiny Committee, who only ever talk about the constitutional stuff, and put European directives and European policy discussions into the hands of the mainstream select committees who actually think about the environmental issues or the justice issues. That would help. But the other people who need to change their act are the media in this country. When was the last time you switched on the TV and watched a British news programme reporting on any decision of the European Parliament or the European Commission or the Council on environmental policy or justice policy or a trade policy? These are important decisions that are taking place, and they are under a cloak of complete media silence. So actually, one other thing you could do, as well as having a go at Conservative politicians, which is always fun, I know, but more productive if you're not in the Conservative Party, is having a little bit of a go at the media and saying, why aren't you covering European policy discussions and debates and decision making?
I'll try and be brief. I'm going to agree with my colleagues on the point that you raised about whether we can keep these opt-outs. I don't think anyone cares that Denmark has an opt-out on defence cooperation, and that we've got this arrangement has been discussed on JHA, which is actually, it was negotiated because we have a different legal system, and we wanted to see how the European Court of Justice actually went about interpreting these things. But that's the detail. But I was at a conference recently and someone described this as a sort of Swiss cheese approach. And I think the Swiss cheese, with the holes being opt-out, is fine as long as the holes aren't too big. And I don't want to mix my metaphors, but as long as Andrea Leadsom doesn't go to the supermarket and nick a lot of Swiss cheese and put holes in them, I think we'll be okay, if you get my meaning, right? So as long as we are cooperating in more areas than we have small opt-outs, I think it's fine. And I think it's the nature of European decision making that when you pool sovereignty, because it's in the interests of all your countries, in some instances there are compromises and there are, some opt-outs for some countries, and we're not the only country to have that kind of arrangement. John, if we do have a referendum, I think it would be very important for pro-European MPs, businesses, trade unions, other parts of society to come together. So I say yes to you on that. I say no to you on the European elections. I think it's incredibly important that we have a competitive European election. I'm afraid, going to come together with Martin and Robert on that. I think it's also important if we could have a debate about what kind of Europe we wanted, rather than whether we're in or out or semi-detached or whatever. And I come to your point, and I'm sorry to disagree with you. I totally agree with you. I think the Conservative Party are driven by a fear of UKIP, and I think they're fearful that they're going to lose to UKIP at the European elections. And I think that is driving the alleged big speech we're going to have by David Cameron on Europe before the end of the year, in which he's going to make apparently some big announcements. And to be perfectly frank, I would rather the majority of Tory MPs were more like my friend here than they are, because I think we'd have a better debate about what we want from Europe, and that might be different, that might differ, but it would be a better and healthier debate. But you are right, Martin, because we do these debates all the time. Often we're the only ones from our parties, because it tends to be the obsessives that go in, but there are quite a large number of them on the Tory side, unfortunately. And on our side, I have to say, it is pretty much a settled question. We've got a handful of Eurosceptics. I could name them, about 9. And they've been Eurosceptics for quite some time. And I think the difference between our party is, in our party, the newer you are, you're an exception, but the newer you are into Parliament, the more pro-European you are. Whereas in the Tory party, it seems that the last 2 intakes have been more anti-European, with exceptions. Anyway, it's more complicated than that. But I do think it is a problem for the Conservative Party, and I wish that it weren't, because I think it would be better for the debate if it weren't such a problem.
I speak as a Conservative, but I do have to agree that the current government's position on Europe has been pretty abysmal. But it's important to remember that Britain didn't become a reluctant and a bit of a pain in the ass in May 2010. All the time that I've been involved in politics, Britain has been the awkward one. Emma, you've been a bit mischievous tonight, and you talk about maybe just 9 Eurosceptics in your party.
Yeah,
so as a mini question for you, I would ask, so what were you doing for your 13 years in government? But my main thrust of my question would be that the three of you have come together tonight in a very harmonious way, other than the slight mischief making. But we don't see that on a grander scale in the House of Parliament. We probably have a referendum coming. This is now a very serious issue. Is it time that we gave up on our politicians and looked elsewhere for leadership on Europe?
Just making the point of Emma, I think the Swiss cheese approach, the French cheese approach, or Europe à la carte as it was also called sometimes, I think that's really coming to an end. The problem is we're now a bloc of 27 countries and everybody wants the whole to be in a different place. So the whole bloc becomes ungovernable, especially if the eurozone deepens its political integration, which is absolutely necessary in order to make it institutionally sustainable in the long run. So, I mean, is Britain prepared to sort of develop a multi-speed Europe, or basically a multi-stage Europe, and move to the place where the country or other countries feel most comfortable? And the last point, as somebody who's also very much involved in the German debate, is a word of how can we turn this around in Britain here a bit quicker than just having discussions here, because there's a real danger of Britain sleepwalking into an exit.
I agree with you. There's always been a slight, unfortunately, there has been an awkwardness in our relationship over the years. But John Major, coming to a Tory rather than coming to a Labour example, he was good mates with Helmut Kohl. He had a good relationship with him back in 1992 when they were negotiating the Maastricht Treaty, and he stopped around the table. Yeah, he negotiated an opt-out from monetary union, he negotiated an opt-out from the social chapter, that was the position of your party, but he stayed around the table. And I think what happened in December was incredibly significant and a big break from the past. Yes, we've opted out of things, and I disagree with you on that point, but I've kind of answered that already. Yes, we've opted out of things. Yes, we haven't always been easy, but we've never walked away. We've always wanted to come to some sort of solution or compromise. What happened in December was very, very big. And I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and I think our stock is incredibly low. I think 9 out of 253 is all right, actually. 9 Eurosceptics out of the sort of mass of Labour MPs. You're always going to have a couple of people who disagree with you, but I think that our party's position on Europe, as I say, is pretty much settled. And if anything, people are getting more pro-European rather than less, and our MPs are very concerned about the debate that's going on. I think we should be talking about the solutions that European policies provide, and I think we need a clearer vision in the future about what we want Europe to deliver for people in terms of especially jobs and prosperity, but other issues as well, rather than dwelling on. I mean, I do worry that this whole process of treaty change is going to take us through years of navel gazing again, and actually opportunities for businesses and people across the EU are going to be found outside the EU, and the more in Britain we are, the greater the risk that we're going to miss those opportunities.
People always go on about the European Court of Auditors not signing off the accounts of the institutions of Europe. But you know, if we use the same standards for the UK government, none of our accounts would ever be signed off, because the DWP's accounts have never squared up. And we've just got a different system of doing it, which is departmental as opposed to the European system, whereby if one part fails, then the whole thing fails. And this idea that we've got some behemoth, this huge organisation in Brussels running our lives, well, it's smaller than your average county council. These simple facts have to be spelt out time and time again, and if we get bored of repeating them, well, finally they've got through to the British public. But to come back to Peter's point, absolutely, we have to talk now about real jobs, the real lives of people, which is why I think the Prime Minister's initiative and his strong message about expanding the single market is something that we have to hang on to and speak about at every available opportunity. Now, we've had a very important deal with South Korea. in the last year or so. We've got negotiations with Singapore. We're going to start those important negotiations with Japan in the next few months. Now the message has got to be out there. To the Dan Hannons of this world, I say, look, are you serious when you say that we can do a better deal on trade as one country of 63 million as opposed to a bloc of 500 million? I know he puts up arguments about other countries and their vested interests, but that's the whole point about the European Union. When you pool your sovereignty, then the vested interests of other member states become only part of the issue and only part of the scene, which is why I think it's far more realistic for us to argue for these sort of major trade deals with big economic blocs as part of the EU. Now, Emma, as I expected to, as a loyal member of the Labour Party and as a spokesman for Europe, has criticised the Prime Minister's approach as being unprecedented last December. I'm not so sure about that. I think we were in a position where, because of Britain's position vis-à-vis the eurozone, then we were always going to have this rather strange status when it came to the negotiations about further integration and the fiscal compact. We were never going to be wholly part of those negotiations because of our status outside the eurozone. And there have been, frankly, worse scenarios where member states have not only just walked away from negotiations but had empty chairs. I mean, de Gaulle did it for a considerable period in the 60s, and then of course we had that compromise, the Luxembourg Compromise. I don't think this is unprecedented. What I think we've got to remember here is that when the British Prime Minister goes into bat, as he rightly does, for the City of London, we don't just talk about the City of London as a British institution, we talk about it as a European institution, because it is the gateway, the main gateway through which so much investment flows in, not only to the UK, but the whole of the European Union. And therefore I have no problem with a British Prime Minister arguing for the vitality of what is a great European institution. And just coming to the point about Europe a la carte, well, the reality is that I don't think we're at the end of an era when it comes to that. You look at Schengen, you look at the neutrality of certain countries that are members of the EU but not members of NATO. This, I don't want to use the phrase pick and mix because it's not quite that, it's a bit glib, but this, it was John Major's phrase, the variable geometry is, I think, a reality. It's actually, in my view, going to be a growing reality because as the EU expands further eastward and southward, we are going to have these, what seem to the likes of Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Guy Verhofstadt, inelegant compromises, but a reflection of the reality of the continent in which we live. We're not the United States of America. We are an unprecedented, unique organism that is now growing in a way that has to be acceptable to its, not just its member states, but to its peoples. And that's something that we've got to remember. Pragmatism has to be at the heart of our pro-Europeanism.
The problem is that there is this kind of, I think, in a way, quite positive vision of a very flexible, very pragmatic European Union with variable geometry, with multiple speeds, with not too many holes, but enough holes in the cheeses to make it acceptable to domestic political audiences and so on. And that's kind of okay, but that's not really where we're heading now. There is clearly a rather different mood, certainly on the economic front within the eurozone, to have a much more tightly integrated and more coherent core to the European Union. And my worry is that if we try and maintain the slight fiction of this sort of multipolar, flexible approach to Europe, when it's no longer the reality, we are in a sense painting ourselves into a corner from which there might only be one exit. So I think we have to be realistic about where Europe is going, and I think we have to work out what the positive vision for Britain within this new Europe is, and I'm not sure that any of the political parties actually have really done that yet. In terms of the parliamentary debate, actually I rather disagree with whoever it was who said that they never hear the pro-European case put in parliamentary debates. Blimey, I've put it endlessly. Emma's put it endlessly. Rob's put it fairly endlessly. Quite a few people have stood up and put it. But it's not very widely reported because we actually not only have a Eurosceptic rhetoric in Parliament, we have a Eurosceptic rhetoric in the media, as I said, and in red top newspapers in particular, but actually across the British media. And the December summit actually was a brilliant example of that. As Emma said, nothing was vetoed actually. We all think, well, lots of people seem to think we vetoed a European treaty. That European treaty is not only going ahead, we've actually enabled it. We've just passed legislation in the House of Commons to make sure that that was possible. So even the British House of Commons isn't vetoing it. We actually, I suppose we could have tried to obstruct it, but we didn't. We've actually, all of us, passed, well, with a few of our more excitable Eurosceptic chums, huffing and puffing in the background, almost everybody in the House of Commons voted for that enabling legislation. So the question is why everyone thought we vetoed it, why David Cameron felt the need to use the language of veto, and why actually, when we weren't presenting particularly unreasonable demands at that summit, why we didn't have a friend in the room. And the answer is that, as the gentleman from Nucleus, sounds slightly strange, sounds like some organisation of mad scientists, but anyway, work on your branding a bit, but maybe just join the European movement, that might be simpler. But that we have allowed this narrative to take hold, where the only acceptable position is this sort of rather Eurosceptic one to some degree or another, and we do have to try and change that narrative. And the hard way to do it is by just writing letters, by phoning into radio programmes and TV programmes and using social media and using everything that we can do, and putting motions to our party conferences if we're members of political parties, and making the case at party fringe meetings, and doing all that hard slog of trying to change political opinion. There is perhaps, though, an easier way to do it, which is to agree to an in-out referendum. And then maybe suddenly there will be the real platform to put the pro-European case. I'm not speaking for my party or even for my International Affairs Committee on this, but I'm beginning to come round to the idea that this is the only way we will lance this boil and have this argument out in public, and actually provide some kind of balance in the media for the pro and anti-European arguments. And I think that would actually, amongst other things, it would mobilise the people that Rob talked about, which are the business people who instinctively understand that we have to be part of Europe for our economic future, but have rather relaxed about it at the moment because they didn't think there was any real risk to that. Or maybe if they really thought there was a risk, then actually that would mobilise those people to finance and support and give voice to a really serious campaign to set out the reasons in favour of Europe for once.
Firstly, please, just if you want to get more involved or understand what's going on, please visit euromove.org.uk for more information. Get involved with the European movement. The Young European Movement in London actually have a social coming up tomorrow. If you don't really like wine, we've got beer and cider tomorrow. But so in this sort of blissful cross-party spirit, could we just have very, very brief final statements on what the way forward is?
It is just a wonderful relief to come into an audience of young people who are pro-European and who are willing to stand up and be counted on this. I think the European movement and the Young European movement are possibly the best possible vehicles to do that, and I'd encourage you to do everything possible you can to raise this argument. Youth politics, certainly when I got involved in it eons ago, was about rebellion. It was about sticking it to party leaders. It was about trying to disrupt the leadership. It was about running against the current of established opinion. That's what made politics fun. And the current of opinion is against Europe, so run against that. Can't challenge it. Oh dear. Yeah, throwing stuff around. Make a noise, come on, and really get out there and challenge it, and be different, and put a different political argument. Maybe only young people can do that.
Well, I'm going to disagree with Martin. When I joined the Conservative Party at the age of 16, I was a one-nation Conservative who believed our future lay in Europe, and I'm 44 now, and I'm a one-nation Conservative who believes our future lies in the European Union. The plates may have shifted about me somewhat, but it's not for me to stand on my island and say how marvellously consistent I am. I think the reality is, despite some of the caricatures we've heard about certain parts of my party, and believe me, all my colleagues, even if I disagree with them, I respect their views, and they have sincerely held views, those who disagree with us. The vast majority of them are far more pragmatic, rather like the British people are, about Europe and about the EU. And I think that whilst, as Martin says, the mood music at the moment in the media and out there in the, the white noise, if you like, is Eurosceptic, I do not believe that somehow we're facing a monolith governing, major governing party in a coalition that is inexorably driving us towards exit because of fear of some fringe party led by a man who perhaps can be described in his more mature moments as a bit bonkers. Coming back to it, call me Mr. McCorber. I've come back to Mr. McCorber again. I remain cautiously optimistic that the Conservative Party will remain pragmatic about Europe, realistic about it, but committed to our continuing membership.
Very briefly, I stand between you and the wine, European wine, I'm sure. The global challenges are getting bigger, but in a strange way, the world is getting much smaller. I didn't have an email account until I was 21. You've all been on email for years, and you've all had mobile phones for years. I think this communication revolution has brought people in a way strangely closer together because they can communicate more easily. So I'm incredibly confident that you are the new internationalists, and I'm also confident that when you go to the supermarket, you'll pay for what you bought.